We talk a lot about physical health, don't we? Tracking our diet, getting our steps in, fighting off whatever bug is going around.
For sure. And we also talk about digital security. We've all got our firewalls, our complex passwords, all this protection against these pervasive online threats.
Exactly. But there's this third and maybe more fundamental kind of security that we rarely consider in such a structured way. And it's the security of our own deeply held beliefs.
It's a huge shift in perspective, really. I think most people treat belief as something passive, like an old family heirloom you just keep locked away somewhere safe.
Right. You just sort of have it.
You just have it. But this approach, the one we're looking at today, it treats belief completely differently. Not as some static possession, but as a living, dynamic organism. Something that requires an active, a constantly built-up defense system.
And that's exactly it. Today, we are opening up a really highly structured methodology that's designed specifically for that, to protect the spiritual self. We got our hands on some fascinating source material. It's titled Faith Immunity, or in the original, Manaa'ah Imaniyyah. And it's structured as this detailed question and answer guide. I mean, it's basically a curriculum, and it seems to be tailored for students who are really focused on the Quranic tradition. This isn't about just passively, holding on to faith.
Not at all.
It's about building a comprehensive, active, and even proactive spiritual defense system.
And what's truly fascinating here, for me, is just the sheer power and the precision of that metaphor, immunity. Mana.
Right.
In medicine, immunity suggests an active built-up defense against pathogens, right? Pervasive systematic threats. But if you apply that spiritually, it suggests that spiritual health isn't your default setting.
That's a big thought right there.
It is. It's something you have to actively and systematically build up, and then you have to constantly maintain it against what these sources identify as a kind of pervasive systematic corruption. This material gives us this remarkably structured analysis, classifying all the internal and external threats to what it calls spiritual constancy, a state known as istiqamah.
And that really defines our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack this idea of imanic immunity, to really understand what it is, to identify its enemies, both the intellectual and the moral ones, and then to catalog the specific tools, the intellectual and practical tools you need to maintain it. For you, the learner tuning in, this is basically a shortcut to understanding an entire operating system for spiritual defense.
And the initial core takeaway, the idea that grounds the whole system, is just crucial. Faith immunity, as it's presented, is protection against two major, really destructive forms of systemic corruption.
Okay.
And they're perfectly matched to the two core aspects of the human experience, the mind and the will.
Let's define those two corruptions really clearly for everyone.
So the first is called fasad al-ilm. And that translates literally to the corruption of knowledge. This is the intellectual sickness. It leads directly to doubt, to confusion, and to fundamental errors in how you understand reality.
So if your foundational knowledge is corrupted,
Then every single choice you make after that is going to be flawed.
and it's like having intellectual malware. It infects the entire hard drive of your mind.
That is a perfect analogy. Precisely. And the second one is fasad al-amal, the corruption of action. This is the practical sickness. This is what results in you succumbing to temptation, in moral decay, in just negligence in your duties.
Okay, so if the first one corrupts your internal map,
Then the second one corrupts your ability to actually walk the path, even if you know the map is correct. If you want spiritual health, the source says you must actively protect both the clarity of your knowledge and the integrity of your will. This immunity framework, it addresses them both systematically.
okay, let's really unpack that core premise then. Before you can even start to build immunity, you have to have a really precise threat assessment. You need to know what you're fighting. And the material, it lays out a very clear enemy blueprint. It says the enemies of faith are classified into two fundamental destructive categories.
That's right.
And they perfectly mirror the two types of corruption we just mentioned. So what are the names of these twin attacks?
We can call it the two-pronged attack because it's always targeting both the intellectual sphere and the sphere of your actions. So the first category of these enemies of faith, they're called ambiguities. In Arabic, that's shubuhat.
Shubuhat. So
Yeah.
these are the intellectual attacks. How do they work?
They're essentially tactics of confusion. Their whole goal is to target the mind, the understanding, the faham. And they aim to introduce doubt or even outright disbelief, which is kufr, and even hypocrisy, nifaq.
So it's not a direct assault, it's more subtle.
It's very subtle. Think of them as the really tricky philosophical questions. the conflicting narratives you see online, the intellectual spirals that are just designed to erode your certainty.
Your yaqeen.
So it's like
Yeah.
it introduces a faulty premise or a confusing contradiction, and it just makes the believer hesitate and start questioning the very foundation of what they believe.
That's it, exactly. If you imagine that sound knowledge is like the sun, then shubuhat are the clouds.
Yeah.
And they're designed to just block the light and make you doubt whether the sun is even there anymore.
So these ambiguities, these shubuhat, they're designed to create this state of, like, internal erosion, a slow decay of certainty.
Yeah, slow decay, exactly. Now, the second category is desires. That's shahawat. These are not intellectual at all. They're practical attacks. They target your will and your individual actions, your amal.
Okay.
Succumbing to these shahawat leads you directly to prohibited actions, or muharamat, and just overall moral deviance. So while the shubuhat are trying to prove that your map is wrong,
The Shaha are offering a shortcut, a much more immediate, glittering detour right off the path.
wait, I have to ask a challenging question here, because I know for you, the learner, this can all sound a bit abstract, is there an overlap here? I mean, can a desire, a shahwa, turn into an ambiguity, a shubha?
That's a brilliant question.
For instance, if I really, really desire wealth way too much, might I then start seeking out intellectual arguments, the shubuhat, to justify some unethical ways of getting it?
Yes, that's a brilliant question. And the methodology absolutely accounts for this convergence. They feed one another. It's a vicious cycle.
Okay, so how does that work?
The shahawat, the desire, it often acts as the primary driver. It's the initial weakness in your will. And if the will is weak, the mind becomes incredibly susceptible to rationalization. You desire the prohibited thing, and then you go out and you seek the intellectual ambiguity to justify that desire.
So the weakness in your action invites the corruption of your knowledge.
Precisely. And that's why the ultimate defense system has to treat them as twin enemies. They require perfectly matched defense mechanisms. You can't fight one without fighting the other.
That makes the stakes incredibly clear. And the source material, it stresses that the ultimate aim of this whole two-pronged attack, the ambiguities and the desires, is just singularly focused on one thing:
One thing.
to prevent the individual from achieving that state of constancy or rectitude, that unwavering steadfastness you called istiqomah.
Absolutely. Istiqomah is the healthy state. It's spiritual equilibrium. And the material is so explicit that these threats are everywhere. They're pervasive. They target every single individual, regardless of your background or where you are right now in your life.
So they're constant internal and external battles.
Constantly. And for you, the listener, really understanding this dual threat and its single objective achieving istiqomah, that's the first essential step in building an appropriate and an effective defense. You just cannot defend against an enemy you haven't correctly identified and categorized.
And this is where we move from diagnosis to the cure. The text emphasizes that protecting yourself from these two distinct enemies requires a perfectly corresponding, a matched defense system. I love the way you put it. You can't fight intellectual malware with just prayer, and you can't fight a deep-seated addiction with just a philosophical argument. So what are the two corresponding pillars of this inner defense?
The defense methodology is, it's engineered to be perfectly dual. You have immunity through knowledge and you have immunity through action. It's like a targeted preventative spiritual medicine.
Okay, let's start by building the intellectual fortress then, the antidote to doubt.
That's the first pillar, immunity through knowledge, or Manaa'ah Imaniyyah. Its primary purpose, as you said, is to combat the ambiguities, the shubuhat.
And how does it work? What's the mechanism?
The core mechanism involves attaining certain sound knowledge alim. And when the source says sound, it means knowledge that is robust, coherent, and completely unshakable. It has to be strong enough to let you distinguish truth from falsehood. You can think of it as the immune system's intelligence department, constantly scanning and verifying the validity of all the information coming in.
So it's the difference between just hearing a fact and possessing the deep, unshakable certainty of that fact, that certainty you called yaqeen.
Precisely, yaqeen. And the text makes it really clear that this whole process requires, first, recognizing the fundamental necessity of having a structured system of knowledge. That's why the source material itself is a curriculum.
It's not just random facts.
No, not at all. This knowledge has to be robust enough to provide real intellectual defense mechanisms, tools you can use to achieve constancy, thabat, and that deep certainty, yaqeen. If your foundational truths are just built on, assumptions or feelings, they are going to crumble the first time they get challenged by a strong shubha.
And the source is insistent that this knowledge has to be active, not just academic. It's not enough to memorize things, is it?
Not at all. I mean, merely possessing the facts is completely insufficient if they're not used as active defensive tools to confront doubt when it arises. The knowledge has to be diligently applied. You have to use it to deconstruct the ambiguities, and you have to use it to strengthen your own yakin.
So if you know something, but you don't use that knowledge to reject an intellectual contradiction when you see one, the whole system fails.
The system fails. Knowledge is the foundation, but it must be constantly exercised like a muscle.
Okay, so knowledge is the anti-doubt measure, the intellectual shield. What of the practical shield? The anti-temptation measure for the will.
That's the second pillar, immunity through action, or Manaa'ah Imaniyyah. This pillar is what primarily combats the desires, the shahawat.
And its mechanism.
Its mechanism is practical devotion, consistent good habits, and a really strict adherence to moral principles. It's all about safeguarding yourself from moral corruption, from that fasad al-amal. This is where the rubber really meets the road.
Okay, so what are the specific requirements for building up this practical immunity?
The requirements are very, very structured. First, and most important, is constancy. That's the but. This is the consistent practice of remaining steadfast in your actions. Not just sporadic bursts of effort, but a sustained, reliable output, even when you're faced with a powerful temptation.
It sounds like showing up to the gym every single day, even on the days you really don't feel like it. The consistency itself is the actual strength training.
That is the perfect analogy. And the second requirement is scrupulousness. The Arabic term is wara. Now, this is a level of piety and caution and diligence that goes way beyond just avoiding the things that are explicitly forbidden.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means creating distance. It's like acting as a perimeter defense, especially when it comes to questionable matters, things that aren't clearly wrong, but they might lead to the muharramat.
Wait, though, I have to push back on this a little, especially for you, the learner, who's trying to navigate this incredibly complex modern world. If scrupulousness, wara, means creating distance from anything questionable, doesn't that risk a kind of paralysis?
It's a great question.
I mean, how does the material advise students to actually function in the world without becoming too fearful or too rigid or so isolated that they just can't act?
That's an excellent challenge and a really important one. The methodology addresses it by connecting wara back to yakin, back to certainty. The scrupulousness isn't born from fear, it's born from clarity.
Okay.
So if you have a crystal clear understanding of your ultimate goal, which is constancy, istiqamah, and you also have a clear understanding of the ultimate consequence, which is corruption, fasad, then avoiding the questionable thing becomes a very logical act of self-preservation. It's not driven by anxiety.
So it's a strategic choice.
It's a strategic choice. The text frames wara as a form of intellectual discipline that you apply to your practical choices. You don't retreat from the world. You interact with it cautiously, and you always prioritize the integrity of your inner state over some fleeting worldly gain.
So it's not about avoiding action. It's about avoiding negligent action.
Yeah.
It's like the highest possible level of spiritual risk management.
Precisely. And this leads us to the whole philosophical underpinning of this pillar of Manaa'ah Imaniyyah. The text provides the profound grounding for why this action is even possible. It links this constancy in action to the profound realization that the world, the dunya, is a temporary, fleeting pleasure. The source calls it zukhruf, which means worldly ornamentation.
Let's unpack that philosophical shift for a second.
Sure.
Why is realizing the world is fleeting so central to resisting temptation?
It all comes down to repricing the temptation. A temptation, a shahwa, it works by making the immediate pleasure seem priceless, essential, urgent.
Right. I need this now.
I need this now. But if the individual truly internalizes the transience of that worldly temptation, if they can genuinely see that material gain or that momentary pleasure or that instant status boost as something they will literally drop and forget in 5 years or maybe even 5 minutes, then the cost of the spiritual compromise suddenly seems infinitely higher.
I see.
The knowledge of the world's transience diminishes the power of the desire itself. So your ability to act correctly flows from a deeply held certainty about the true low value of the temptation.
I see. So the intellectual pillar provides the data, and the action pillar is the disciplined execution based on that data. It sounds like if you have both the right intellectual defenses and the right practical defenses, this isn't some program you complete and then you can relax.
No, not at all.
It sounds like an internal, continuous striving. The source calls this jihad. Right. It touches on this idea of constancy being non-negotiable, a necessary state of continuous spiritual exertion.
That's the critical insight, exactly. Once you've established the theoretical dual immunity, the discussion immediately moves into the rigorous practical application required for maintenance, and that is spiritual striving, or jihad.
Now, when the source talks about jihad here, we need to be very clear. We are discussing the inner spiritual struggle, right? The relentless striving against one's own weaknesses.
Correct, 100%. Jihad, in this specific context, is defined as the striving to consistently act upon the dictates of your faith and remaining steadfast against all this pervasive corruption. It's the continuous, never-ending effort that's required to keep your immune system functioning at its peak, proactively searching for and eliminating threats.
It's the maintenance contract on your spiritual health.
That's a great way to put it.
So what are the fundamental prerequisites for achieving this state of sustained striving and immunity?
The prerequisites are, they're demanding, and they really highlight the seriousness of this whole methodology. First, you have to possess a constant striving spirit, a real commitment to perpetual improvement. And secondly, you must cultivate patience. Saber.
Patience is so often viewed as a passive thing, just waiting. How does the text frame saber in the context of active spiritual maintenance?
It frames saber as active endurance. It's a force, and it's required in two forms. First, there's patience in performing the necessary actions, meaning you endure the difficulty of, say, waking up for your duties or resisting the temptation to just take it easy.
Okay.
And then there's patience in resisting forbidden desires, meaning you endure the pangs of temptation without giving in. Saber is the engine that maintains constancy, that is istiqamah. Without it, your striving is just intermittent and completely unreliable.
So it's not a virtue, it's an operational requirement.
It's an operational requirement for the whole defense system. And finally, all of this has to rest on a firm foundation of faith, of Iman, which provides the ultimate motivation for the whole struggle. And this striving, it has a dual function, which is explicitly outlined in the source. You strive to protect yourself from external threats, the enemies of the religion, whether they are people or institutions or just destructive cultural influences. And crucially, you strive against your own internal weaknesses. The ego, or the self, the nafs, is often the hardest and most insidious enemy.
Why is that?
Because it's the source of all your rationalizations, your laziness, your self-deception. It can compromise the entire system from the inside out without you even realizing it.
Speaking of that internal battle, the source places a really heavy emphasis on protecting the internal state. Where is the most crucial point of defense within a person?
The heart, the kolb. It's identified as the central processor. It's the primary target for all corruption. If the heart is compromised by doubt or by moral decay, the entire system, your knowledge, your action, your certainty, it all collapses. So protecting the heart is absolutely foundational to Imanic community.
And how do you protect it?
You have to rigorously guard the sensory inputs that feed the heart.
Let's talk about that concept of guarding the inputs. It sounds exactly like a mental cybersecurity protocol for the digital age we live in.
That analogy is perfect. The gates have to be locked. And this involves protecting the senses, particularly sight and hearing, from forbidden things that plant the seeds of shahawat desires or shubuhat ambiguities.
So it's not just about avoiding major sins.
Not at all. Protecting your sight isn't just about that. It's about controlling the constant input stream, the endless scrolling, the sensationalized news, the frivolous consumption, all the things that plant these tiny seeds of doubt or envy or illicit desire in your heart over time.
So it's the small daily exposure to what you're calling polluted input that really undermines the long-term integrity of the heart.
Exactly. And the source adds a third crucial input, the tongue. It has to be protected from sins like gossip, slander, falsehoods. And the tongue is interesting because it's both an input, you hear what you say, and it's an output because it spreads corruption externally.
So those three: sight, hearing, and the tongue, they're the primary gateways through which corruption enters and spreads.
That's right. If you allow polluted input, you simply cannot maintain a pure inner state.
That really puts the burden of responsibility back entirely on the individual, doesn't it? To curate their own mental and spiritual environment. But, maintaining that level of vigilance sounds exhausting. How do you maintain that constant state of alert, that proactive defense?
The source gives a very specific tool for that. It's by using divine remembrance, or dhikr. The source singles out dhikr as a crucial, continuous factor in building and maintaining this immunity.
How does it work?
You can think of it as a constant ping back to the central server. It keeps you alert, focused, and connected. And by doing that, it directly shields the self from the dangerous state of heedlessness. The term is ghafla.
What exactly is ghafla in this context?
Ghafla is the opposite of constancy. It's a kind of spiritual oblivion, a state of profound vulnerability where your guard is completely down. When a system is heedless, it's not actively monitoring threats, it's not verifying inputs, it's not executing its duties, it's just running on autopilot.
Waiting for a crash.
Exactly, just waiting for the first strong shuha or shawa to crash the whole thing. Deeker is the firewall that prevents ghafla from taking hold. It keeps the spiritual antenna constantly upright and receiving.
That moves us really logically into the external factors. So we have the internal striving, jihad, protecting the heart, qalb, and maintenance through remembrance, dhikr. Let's pivot now and break down the explicit categories of external threats, the specific forms of worldly corruption or fitna that specifically target a believer's steadfastness.
Right, so moving from the general principles to the specific vulnerabilities, the material provides a very precise taxonomy of these external threats, these fitna. These are the elements of worldly life that have a kind of gravitational pull to yank you away from istiqamah, from constancy.
And the sources break this down into 4 key areas of temptation. Let's tackle them one by one and really give them the attention they deserve.
Absolutely. The first is corruption related to wealth, mal. And this isn't just about, avoiding theft. It's about the ethical compromises that are driven by the acquisition and the hoarding of wealth.
Could you give an example?
Sure. Compromising your honesty in a business deal, for example, or prioritizing profit over your ethical responsibility. The love of mal, of wealth, it creates this internal conflict where your principles get sacrificed for material gain. And that directly weakens the action pillar, your Manaa'ah Imaniyyah.
So the pursuit of wealth itself becomes a vector for corruption if it's not tethered to principle. Okay, what's the second category?
The second is corruption related to the self, the nafs. This refers to all the temptations of ego, pride, fame, self-importance. A person might be outwardly religious and knowledgeable, but if the desire for status or recognition is what drives their actions, then their sincerity, their ikhlas, is corrupted.
So it's not the action that's corrupt.
No, it's the internal motivation behind it. This fitna attacks the very core of your intention, and it can make any good deed spiritually worthless because it's rooted in self-glorification, not in devotion to a higher principle.
That's a crucial distinction. Okay, now for the third, which I think often impacts daily life very deeply, family.
The third is corruption related to progeny or family, walad. This is one of the most insidious threats because it cloaks corruption in the guise of affection and responsibility.
How does it manifest? How would you see that play out?
By compromising your own spiritual principles for the sake of, say, a child's worldly advancement. For example, prioritizing your child's material success or their status over their moral development, or even teaching them to bend ethical rules to get ahead in the dunya. The love for family, when it's taken to an excess, can actually override the love for rectitude.
That is highly relatable. It's a challenge every single parent faces. That balance between caring for your children's needs and ensuring their moral compass stays fixed. Okay, and the fourth category.
The final category is corruption related to worldly glory or status. The word is zukhruf. This is the temptation of appearance, of luxury, of living a life that's just driven by superficial ornamentation.
The keeping up with the Joneses effect.
Exactly. This kind of corruption distracts the mind and it drains resources, your time, your effort, your attention. That really should be allocated to strengthening your spiritual immunity. It is the continuous low-level drone of consumption and comparison that just makes you forget the temporary nature of this world.
So these 4 categories, wealth, self, family, and status, are like the material chains that attach you to the temporal world. So what is the single overarching antidote to all this material corruption?
The antidote is constant vigilance against these worldly temptations and vitally maintaining a continuous focus on the afterlife. The idea that the dunya is transient, that all of this is just mere ornamentation, it has to be a constant, active piece of your knowledge base, your Manaa'ah Imaniyyah.
Why is that so powerful?
Because if you truly see worldly glory and status and wealth as fleeting, disposable assets, their power over your will and your actions just diminishes radically.
So the antidote to the fitna of the world is actually built into the philosophical framework of that knowledge pillar we discussed earlier. Okay, now let's talk about the social dimension. The source speaks pretty extensively about the role of companionship, suhbah.
This is identified as a critical external factor. The danger is associating with people who are heedless, the ghafloon, people who are spiritually asleep, or even worse, those who are actively deviant. Your environment, your suba, is key to your spiritual health because it acts as a vector.
A vector.
Yes. If your close companions are constantly encouraging or embodying shubuhat, doubt, or shahawat, desire, your own immunity is immediately compromised.
It's like spiritual passive infection. You might be trying your best to maintain istiqamah, but your immediate environment is constantly injecting pollutants into your system.
Precisely. Your environment either supports your jihad or it sabotages it. And therefore, the solution requires actively seeking out righteous companionship and rigorously avoiding places or individuals that promote or encourage the twin enemies.
So it's a conscious choice.
It's a conscious choice. For the student of faith, the intended audience of this curriculum, this is framed not as optional social advice, but as a non-negotiable step to maintain the integrity of their striving. If you want a strong immune system, you cannot stay in a room full of active contagion. It's that simple.
We've covered moral and social threats. Let's go back one last time to the intellectual battlefield. The source highlights a final, very specific intellectual threat posed by the enemy: hypothetical doubt, the classic circular philosophical trap that seems to exist purely to create cognitive burnout.
This is a highly sophisticated attack model. The source mentions that Satan attacks the believer by posing these hypothetical intellectual questions that are designed to lead nowhere. The classic infinite regress argument, who created God? Or what happens beyond the boundary of reality? This is a pure shubha that's designed not to introduce a rational counterargument, but simply to create an intellectual spiral and, as you said, exhaustion.
That's the classic philosophical trap, isn't it? It's designed to undermine certainty by attacking the very concept of a first cause. You can't necessarily disprove it with human logic because it's designed as a trap to move beyond the limits of human reason.
Exactly.
So how does the methodology advise responding to such an unanswerable, exhausting question?
The material instructs that the believer should recognize the trap and then not engage. Just do not get into the endless spiral of doubt. To engage with a hypothetical question that's designed to have no answer is to lose energy and to weaken your certainty.
So what's the practical strategy?
Immediate de-escalation. The believer must rely on their existing certainty, their yaqeen, seek refuge implicitly in the divine, and then forcefully redirect their thoughts away from the trap.
So the defense isn't an intellectual counter-argument at all. It's a disciplined psychological shift back to the known certain foundations. You just recognize the intellectual malware for what it is, a distraction, and you refuse to give it any of your processing power.
Exactly. This reliance on certainty and redirection is a crucial practical strategy for shutting down these debilitating intellectual traps before they can compromise the entire system. It acknowledges that the goal of the ambiguity is often just the exhaustion of the individual, not some grand intellectual refutation of a concept. The defense is simple. You already know the truth, so do not entertain the lie that's designed to waste your time.
Okay, so we've established the duality of the threat ambiguity versus desire and the duality of the defense knowledge versus action. We've categorized the external enemies, the fitna. Now, let's look even closer at the specific granular actions that act as spiritual vaccinations, according to the text. What are the key mechanisms for daily spiritual health and maintenance?
The methodology emphasizes several internal practices that are just essential for building robust, sustainable spiritual health. The first, and maybe the most critical for longevity, is non-negotiable. Self-accountability. The term is musaba.
For the modern learner listening, how can we frame musaba? Is it like a kind of spiritual audit or maybe a KPI dashboard for your heart?
Both of those are perfect analogies. Musaba is the act of constantly monitoring your own heart, your intentions, your ikhla, and your actions, and ensuring precise adherence to the overall methodology. It is the heart's constant internal auditor.
And you do this? When?
It should be performed daily, even hourly, just constantly checking your inputs and outputs against the principles you're trying to live by.
And what does this constant auditing prevent?
Musaba serves as the vital antidote to moral compromise. The text issues a really stern warning against what it calls negligence or tasahul in your practical duties. Even small compromises are seen as points of weakness, as vulnerabilities that can lead to major systemic corruption down the line.
So you let one little thing slide.
You let one little thing slide, say some negligence in worship, or a small ethical corner you cut at work, and you've just opened a loophole in the entire system. The source warns that the system degrades incredibly rapidly if self-accountability is abandoned.
Okay, so if self-accountability is the constant monitoring, what are the basic functions that need to be monitored and upheld? What are the foundational practices that keep the system running?
That leads us right to the next point. Strengthening the foundational principles. These are the meticulous practices that you have to uphold to maintain immunity. They are the essential pillars. First, there is sincerity. Ikhla.
We've touched on that. Purity of intention.
The absolute purity of intention in all actions. Sincerity ensures that your actions are truly for spiritual benefit and not for worldly validation or status. If the intention is corrupted, the action, even if it looks correct on the outside, offers zero spiritual defense against the fitna of the self, the nafs.
So intention is the energy source that powers the whole system.
Exactly. Second is following the path. The word is ittiba. This just means strict adherence to established sound teachings and methods. This provides the reliable blueprint and structure for your immune system, and it prevents misguided effort or, innovation that could destabilize the whole framework.
You need a tested, reliable architecture, not one you're constantly making up as you go along.
Precisely. And third is steadfastness in worship. And the source specifically references prayer, reading the Quran, and remembrance, dhikr. Consistency is the non-negotiable goal here. These foundational practices are the regular vaccinations that keep the system robust. They are non-negotiable acts of daily maintenance that keep the heart alert and the knowledge sharp.
This really sounds like a closed, self-sustaining loop. You have sound, certain knowledge that informs sincere action, which is then constantly monitored by accountability, which in turn reinforces the knowledge.
That's the perfect synthesis of it. It is a self-sustaining system, but it requires that constant striving, that jihad, to keep it going. And the text does not mince words at all about what happens if this loop is broken.
Which brings us to the consequence of abandoning immunity.
That's right. If the individual abandons this dual defense system by neglecting either their knowledge or their action, they fall immediately into that dangerous state of heedlessness, of ghafla, or even outright deviance. The material stresses that abandoning these protective practices leaves you vulnerable to spiritual sickness.
And that sickness could be intellectual, like doubt.
The shubuhat, yes. Or it could be moral, like desire, the shahawat.
And that vulnerability is total, isn't it? Because once you're heedless, you stop auditing yourself, you stop striving, you stop learning.
The whole defense system fails. What stands out to me in this conclusion is how the certainty, the yakin, is what drives the behavior. When the knowledge is weak, the self-accountability, the musabah, and the constancy, the istiqamah, will inevitably fail. You absolutely need certainty to fuel the action, and you need constant action to maintain the certainty. The two pillars are completely inseparable components of a single, unified spiritual fortress. So to synthesize this entire methodology for you, the learner, the concept of faith immunity, Manaa'ah Imaniyyah, it's not a passive wish, it's a total defense package. It requires an intellectual defense through sound knowledge against the threat of ambiguities, the shubuhat.
And a practical defense through steadfast action against the corruption of desires, the shahawat.
That's the system.
And the ultimate goal isn't just to avoid harm, is it? It's to achieve istiqamah, that state of constancy and rectitude, a continuous, highly functional state of spiritual well-being.
And that achievement is predicated on rigorous, relentless striving, on jihad. It's about constant vigilance through accountability, meticulous guarding of the central organ, the heart, and controlling all the sensory inputs that seek to corrupt it. It is, in essence, a curriculum for spiritual self-mastery designed to operate proactively in a very corrupt world.
The path forward, according to this methodology, is, well, it's intensely demanding. It's framed not as a static destination you finally arrive at, but as a continuous daily process of building and then maintaining an internal fortress against pervasive corruption. It demands that we treat our spiritual health with the exact same rigor and dedication that we apply to our most valued physical or material assets.
We have to allocate our resources where they matter most.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the learner. We spend significant time and energy and resources protecting our physical bodies, our financial wealth, and our professional reputation. If the deepest teaching in this ancient yet highly structured methodology is that the greatest enemy is the duality of doubt and desire, and that the greatest asset we possess is our faith, our iman, then how must that fundamental belief change the allocation of your energy, your attention, and your effort every single day? This deep dive into faith immunity offers a truly challenging answer to that question.